Today we're just talking about creativity beyond the human. This is one of the the events that we hold with the guest authors of our volumes, and that's because we're like at Wimblu, we really care about creating this sort of network, you know, not just this community, not just with the people who reads our magazine, but also with the authors who contribute their beautiful and talented work to our publication. So it's very important for us to create these spaces where we can get to meet the authors a little bit more and know more about their person. Oh, hello. Yeah. And, you know, get to know a little bit more of their worldviews and then create this sort of conversation that it's so important to us, and that all these authors are also exploring on how to create stories in these times of transition and uncertainty, and how to expand our narratives, you know, beyond the human. So that is a little bit of what we'll be exploring today with Sophie. So I think for many, Sophie needs no introduction, but I'm going to do a formal one anyway. So today we're talking with Sophie Strand. She's an American writer who focuses on the intersections of spirituality, storytelling, and ecology. She just published her book, The Flowering One, Rewilding the Sacred Masculine. That was published by Inner Traditions last fall in 2022. And she has another book coming, which is The Madonna Secret. It's her eco-feminist historical fiction reimagining of the gospel. So really looking forward to that. And that will also be published by Inner Traditions in spring 2023, right, Sophie? Yeah. And she's also the author of the article, What is the Underworld? Which is a story that is part of our volume 6 on community. So yeah, make yourselves comfortable, whoever's joining, and we can just like dive right into it. I was going to say, Sophie, that in your text, What is the Underworld, which, as I just mentioned, is the one we just published in our latest magazine, there are two lines that I think can help us open up our conversation today. And one of that lines reads, the underworld taught Orpheus that true creation requires us to relinquish ownership. And then later you write, we're going to need to drop below human exceptionalism into the underworld of symbiotic co-creation. So two beautiful lines that can help us dive straight into our topic today of creativity beyond the human. Can you tell us a bit more about these ideas of relinquishing ownership and symbiotic co-creation? What does it mean for you to create outside of this individualistic and anthropocentric paradigm?
Well, thank you for having me here today, for including my work in this wonderful project that is being woven together. So I think it's important to realize that we have a really, really simplistic, inaccurate idea of evolution and how life comes into being, that things are forking and differentiating. But the most biological novelty, the most creative, transformative moments in scientific history, in the history of our own bodies, happen when two beings decide to merge and collaborate. And that it's these moments of horizontal communication where things fuse instead of fork that hold the most potential to transform the very face of the earth. You know, the best example is every flower you see today, every fruit you eat, every hill, every forest, every landscape, the entire topography of the earth is created by the symbiotic collaboration, the risky collaboration between early land-dwelling plants and mycorrhizal fungi. And that it was only this symbiotic merger that created the potentiality for ecosystems, for forests, for all sorts of rooted life that made our own bodies, our own morphologies possible. So, and even deeper back, multicellular life is the product of two very simple cells half digesting each other and incompletely doing that experience and creating the complex nucleated cells that build our bodies today. I oftentimes say that we are the product of an anarchic act of lovemaking and indigestion. And so symbiosis, this moment where we say, I will burn the bridge to my old body, I will jump into another body, that is what is powered evolution and powered creativity, that it's often in moments of climatological pressure that beings who wouldn't normally collaborate are forced to do it because they're hungry and because they're desperate. And we're in a moment in time where we are desperate. Many different species are desperate. So perhaps the best way forward is not this individual, rugged approach where we're constantly just on the hero's journey, but a more complicit, involved ability to look at other species that are suffering and saying, if we join hands, perhaps we'll do something more creative.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Thank you, Sophie. And like, how do you think this translates to your creative process? You know, this fusing instead of forking up, you know, like, how do you bring this to your process?
That's a great question. So I think very simply, you know, storytelling emerges. I oftentimes say that human beings tell stories, but stories came before human beings, that it's the genius loci, it's the spirit of place speaking through us. That if you look at myth, what it really is, it's personified elementals. It's the nature, the natural constellation of beings and species of a place that are talking through us and trying to teach us how to be in right relationship. And the best way to transmit that information is through a compelling narrative, especially during oral culture where you can't write things down. So the most compelling way to keep that relationship alive, to keep that dialogue alive, is through storytelling. And so I think that if we can remember and resurrect that dialogue, that understanding that everything we do is a dialogue, it's not a monologue, that every time we speak into an environment, the world can speak back. I oftentimes say that if you notice a plant or an animal, it's because it's noticing you. And we need to bring back that reciprocity and that risk that another being could speak back to us with a language that we don't necessarily immediately understand, but that we need to include within our ecosystem of concerns. And so one thing I say is, you know, right now there can be the heavy burden of trying to understand whole ecosystems and trying to advocate for everything. But every person is going to have a wound in them, a shape in them that is the exact shape of another species, one other being. And if you find it, you can become an interlocutor, a mouthpiece, that maybe they don't speak English, but you can provide a dialogue, a channel of communication between a bluebird, the mustard greens, the lake that people are trying to manage and get rid of. You know, can you become a mouthpiece for another species? That can you tell stories where you aren't the main character, where you are trying to be of service to another being, and you're keeping that dialogue open so that you never think that your understanding is fixed. So we need to keep asking questions of our environments, of the plants, the insects, the microbes that create and constitute the 5-mile radius of where we actually live, and say, how can I be of service? How can I use my creative abilities, my, my activism to be a mouthpiece for you?
That's beautiful. I really want to bring back this line you said, that the world can speak back, you know, and this imagination that it takes to listen to that world speaking back. Because as you say, it's not going to be in the language that we're used to, that we're familiar, you know, so it takes, you know, a little bit of expanding to really listen. And I want to weave that with what you said about myth, because I've noticed that your work often, you know, it threads myths with this knowledge about nature that has come to us through modern science and natural history, which is, you know, it's also a sort of myth-making approach, but it's like the one that it's very central to our lives in our society today. But you weave them so naturally and so nicely in your text. And I'm wondering, you know, what's the relationship between these two, between myth and this scientific knowledge in your creative process? Because there's a sort of fusion there that you're practicing as well. And it has to do with this listening back as well. Yeah.
I think that myth and science are seen as being opposed, but I would say that they stem from a very similar impulse. And in some ways, myth is an original science. It's a way of asking questions of our environment. That myth personifies elementals while science quantifies them. But they're both actively trying to understand how things work, how weather systems work, why natural disasters happen, how come we die, how come other beings die. That they're a way of asking questions.
Mhm.
My favorite example is if you look at our earliest human artistic artifacts, they are often represent human animal hybrids, theriomorphs. So, you know, the Trofer shaman in France has, like, you know, a lion face, like owls, feathers, a tail, antlers, but is also a human. You have the lion man that was unearthed from 30,000 years ago, which is half lion, half man. And so the earliest human preoccupation, artistic preoccupation, is not with, you know, just animals or just humans, but that merger between them. And instead of looking at this as some kind of like colonial primitivist way, we could say that this is actually an ancient and incredibly accurate way of having a scientific inquiry. Because if we
Mm.
look at our evolutionary deep tree existence, we did used to be animals. If we look at our bodies as holobionts, which are, you know, beings composed of other beings, we are composed of otherness. We are not just human. We are always slipping and leaking into other species. We are self through other. And so if you look
Mm.
at these early theriomorphs across all of these different artistic traditions, you can see an early scientific inquiry, which is, how are we made? We are made through other beings. We share a flesh rhizome with animals, with deers, with trees, with ecosystems. And so I sometimes say that, like, if you look at these early pieces of art, they're an early type of scientific inquiry. And I think
Mm.
the thing about science today is it's become burdened with a kind of theology that, you know, you see the spirit mind split of Christianity just get rearticulated as
Mhm.
mind and matter and as material reductionism, and that there's also a lot of homunculism. There are a lot of like explanations, descriptions dressed up as explanations in science, and
Mm.
given a lot of like theological hoopla when we actually don't really understand what we're looking at. So if we need to look at scientism as a kind of
Mm.
theology that breaks down the resilient inquiry of actual scientific thought. And so myth making is about constantly asking your environment how best to live there, how to honor and weave yourself into the web of relations. And I think when science is really working well, it's a verb, it's a way of asking questions rather than creating dogma.
Mm. That's so beautiful. Thank you, Sophie, and so necessary as well, you know, to sort of I really like this thing that you say, that this description disguised as explanation, you know. I think that's so
Yeah.
predominant right now, and it's so true. And I wonder, you know, about your texts again, because and about your own creative process, you know. So you're weaving these sort of like myths, which I love it how you understand it, this like original science, original inquiry, right? And then you're bringing in like these sort of more of like modern conceptions or descriptions of nature, and then you're doing your own thing, you know. So would you describe your practice a little bit as myth making in itself, you know, like
I
is
would say
this
it's
one
a
of your
compost.
purposes?
So we live in a culture where we're traumatized, we are deracinated from living on the land and right relationship with each other. And so we're constantly trying to create stable value systems and to control
Mm.
ecosystems and each other because we're so scared. So that's, it can be very violent, but it does stem from a kind of cultural body experience of fear and isolation.
Mm.
And I think we live in an antibiotic culture. So when I say antibiotic, I'm not talking about antibiotics, the medicine. I'm talking about against life, where we try and
Mm.
sterilize and clean up and manage through sterilization. And so we're trying to constantly organize and order and create boundaries. But the truth is that life is most creative when it
Mm.
leaks and when it works by addition.
Mm.
And the compost heap is this wonderful antidote to control, which is, it's probiotic. You add the bad, the good, the neutral, the weird, and then
Mm.
something sprouts. Some soil is made so something new can sprout.
Mm.
So in my own discipline, I try and add enough onto the compost heap that something really resilient, some really nourishing soil can be made. And that when I don't add enough on,
Mm.
I'm monocropping. If I was just writing from one perspective, I would be
Mm.
re-articulating the monological thinking of this anthropocentric culture. because ecosystems are resilient in
Mm-hmm.
as much as they are diverse, as they represent a tangled, reticulated web of many different species, sometimes negotiating, sometimes antagonistically relating. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
in our sense making, in our epistemologies, we need to work with diversity, with different perspectives, to create an
Mm.
ecology of practices, to borrow the term from one of my favorite thinkers, Isabel Stengers.
Mm. Yes, exactly. And I think you're just pointing at something that it's also very important for us at Wimblu, which is it's not only to have this like diversity of voices in your like the narratives that you create and how you're fitting those narratives, but also how do you leave space for the reader, you know? Because
Exactly.
we're so like right now we're overwhelmed with narratives that they want to tell you what to think or how to feel or what the solution is or what the path is. There's often this narrative of trying to convince you of something, right? And I think that one important thing for us at Wimblu is that we can have stories that are open, you know, and
Yeah,
you're
exactly. And then
leaving space
oftentimes,
for the reader. Yeah.
one of my favorite writers and thinkers is Lynn Haginian, who's a poet. She wrote this amazing text called The Rejection of Closure, and how
Mm.
open texts are like female bodies, where the orgasm can happen anywhere. There are many different openings. There's no
I love
ending.
that.
It's a circle. And
Mm-hmm.
we can think of as stories as being open to different experiences and to being
Mm-hmm.
changed. And an open text, an open story also lets the reader come in and change it, that it's open
Mm.
to many different interpretations. And so I've been
Mm-hmm.
thinking a lot about open texts and open bodies, bodies that are, I think sick bodies are highly aware of their porosity. And that can be
Mm.
complicated, but it can also be liberating when you realize that you are open to otherness. You can be physically, chemically changed by other beings, by
Mm-hmm.
interactions. You can be irrevocably changed by interactions with other beings. That's both a
Mm.
beautiful and terrifying thing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, I also think that there is a human desire to accelerate into the next story without trying to figure out if it's the right story. And my favorite
Mm.
example are hermit crabs, which when they grow out of one of their shells, so they don't produce the shells themselves, they find them. And when they grow out of one, my dog is being crazy. You have to stop. That was so bad of you. Um, and when they grow out of one shell, they usually find the next one, but it's not the right size. And so they have to do something incredibly scary and risky, which is that they exit their old shell, not a good fit. They're fleshy and vulnerable, and they wait next to the other incorrectly sized shell. And they oftentimes wait hours. And then, oftentimes, if it works correctly, a bunch of hermit crabs will coalesce and then do something called a vacancy chain and all exchange stories. And so I was thinking
Mm.
that how can we hold each other in that fleshy, vulnerable state where we're not immediately accelerating into a solution and into a story that's maybe not correctly tailored to exactly what we need? How can we
Mm-hmm.
help each other navigate these narrative liminalities so that we can wait for the right shell? And then can we
Mm.
create communities where we can mutually help each other come up with different ideas with different shells?
Mm, that's so beautiful. Thank you for that sample that you're bringing because I think it speaks about this time so much. You know, how do we dwell in this uncertainty? You know, without rushing to grab onto the next thing. And I'm wondering, you know, again, just trying to pull the conversation back to your own process and to your own like creative methods. Let's say, um, how do you keep in mind this openness? Like, how do you practice this permeability in your text so that others can like sort of like permeate it, you know, and convert it and practice this like biotic kind of writing that you're talking about? Yeah.
That's a really good question. I think for me, it's about having a humility to change my mind and to realize that
Mm,
storytelling used to be about adaptability, that it was oral. So that meant it was relational, always spoken to other beings and to an environment with the capability of being held responsible, of responding.
mm,
And that it decayed as you spoke it into the air, that it was process. It affirmed that life is a gerund. Life moves and is relational and interstitial. And so for me, what I'm constantly trying to understand and do is offer my work in process so that other people can enter it and change it, give me better ideas, that my ideas don't perhaps belong to me, they belong to the breath I share with all of the different beings that read them and then respond. And I think we think better when we think together, when we think with our entire web. And so I think that's one of the things about social media that I do actually enjoy, is that you can risk sharing your work and you can complicate the idea of the genius, the individual. You can say, here's my work, it's in process. Do you have a better way of looking at it? Do you have a suggestion? Can we think together? And I think also we're in a moment of crisis. And if you're still holding your idea when the tsunami comes, when the fires come, you've lost the game of hot potato. You know, give your ideas away. That's what I try and do a lot, so that perhaps someone else can think them better. So I think we constantly need to be practicing giving our ideas away. And I'm trying to do that with social media a lot. And to not, you know, there are people who just straight up, you know, plagiarize me. Just take my work and plagiarize me. And that can be really frustrating. And I think for women and for people who are not non-white or male, the experience of dropping out of the footnotes and being plagiarized or just have your work stolen can be really traumatic. But we're also not brands. And we also don't own anything we say. And so there's a flip side, which is, can I just begin to move so fast and share so many ideas that I'm not a brand, that I'm not a fixed thing, that no one can copy me and steal me, because I'm a whole network of beings.
This is beautiful, and I think it just turns around the idea, because so many out there are, you know, sort of like creating in this rush for creating, but due to a pressure of productivity, you know. But what you're saying is different, because you're a very prolific writer, you know. You're like constantly sharing, as you say. But if you do it not from the logic of like productivity and, you know, feeding, you know, sort of like creating this brand or feeding the market with your products in a way, but rather than this sharing, this attitude of sharing. And also what I love about this is that it requires to relinquish perfectionism, you know, which is the other thing that I think stops creativity so much, right?
I've just been looking at this great essay, I forget who it was by, but it was about the characteristics of white supremacy and how perfectionism and individualism are highly tied to internalized white supremacy. And so for me, complicating this idea of the finished text, the perfect text, the proofread text, the text that's just by me and is perfect, it is important in interrupting internalized white supremacy. Perfectionism is a kind of whiteness. Like, can we interrupt that?
That's great. Yeah. And it's not just perfectionism. It's also, it sort of creates an authority, you know. Who has the authority to create? Well, like, if you look at, like, from your point of view, that we're in this like creative evolution, then we're all here really to create, you know. This is what we're doing, you know. We're merging, we're forming, we're evolving. So it really changes, you know. If you see it from that place, it really changes what creativity can be, you know. You don't need the permission, you don't need to be like in a perfect space, or you don't even need to be like a professional or anything, you know. It's just by existing, you know, there's this creative process going on.
If you wait for your accolades from the academy, you know, you may not have any time left. That, you know, storytelling is an emergency, creativity is an emergency. We need to try a lot of different ways of collaborating and working together and imagining adjacent possibles. And if we're waiting for the correct conditions, we're probably going to become obsolete. We need to try back. I sometimes say, like, don't learn crow correctly, speak crow badly, speak mountain badly, speak river badly. Just start today.
Love that. Yeah.
If you wait to start, you'll never start that dialogue, and you'll never risk learning as you go.
It sort of feels, you know, you can bring it like when you're starting a new language and then you're shy and you don't want to try it because you know you're going to do it wrong, and it's sort of like this calling that you're bringing. It's beautiful, you know, that we start to speak back, you know, even, and that's how it happened in a way. I think that's how language sort of evolved, you know. We were speaking back, and then these codes started to form around it, but it took that courage, you know, to sort of like, as you say, speak back and also listen to what's coming, you know?
Yeah, I mean, and that's also another thing, is, can you learn to listen with your whole body? So sometimes I say to people, what would it be like to bring a poem you wrote to the land that inspired it and read it to the land, and then to wait with your whole body to see how the land responds? Like, do you feel a tightening in your belly? Are there crows shouting at you? Did the sun just suddenly come out from behind a cloud? That there are ways that the land communicates to us that are oblique, that are subtle, but our body is an instrument that has evolved in an environmentally embedded way to receive this stimuli, to receive this intimacy. And we can learn in a very slow daily way to ask questions and then to realize that our whole body is the receptor.
I like that. And I really like how it weaves into our conversation today to understand that, you know, creativity beyond the human, it's beyond so many other things, you know, it's beyond the individualistic paradigm, it's beyond the anthropocentric, it's beyond, you know, the perfectionism. So, you know, when we say beyond the human, it really means to just dismantle all the systems that, you know, that kind of trying to define what being human was, you know, right? So
I sometimes say, who stuck this stake in the river of evolution and said that was the last monkey, this was the first human? That species, in fact, there's a lot of really good scholarship out there about the whole idea of species are very tied to racism. And not actually to any kind of scientific reality, that it's actually very hard to distinguish where one species ends and another begins genetically. And that we became very interested in the idea of species when we were trying to say that there were some people who were this kind of people and there were some people who were not. And so we can complicate our idea of speciesism. We don't even know where we end and begin.
And this takes me, you know, I had this other question, which is to move into the topic of imagination, you know, and if we sort of understand ourselves as you're speaking, you know, as being more than human, you know, as just of like relinquishing these borders, this very defined idea of what we are. If we're like collective beings in constant flux, what does this mean for imagination? You know, how does the practice of imagination look under this paradigm for you?
Well, I think that it lets us imagine things that we couldn't have, you know, I'm trying to think about a way into this. So a great way is miracle mind. So the brain works over the course of a human lifetime as a kind of pruning, homogenizing effect, which is when we're very young, we receive so much stimuli that it's hard to make sense of the world. That even today we're receiving so much sensory stimuli second by second that if we received it all, we would be incapacitated. And what the brain is built to do is to create this kind of these patterned pathways of expectations. We homogenize our reality. Oftentimes we're seeing what we expect to see, not what's actually happening, as a way of predicting and taking care of ourselves. And for most of human history, this neural pruning, this sensory gating happened in an environmentally embedded way. It was a way of distinguishing certain plant life against a sea of green, of reading a weather pattern in the clouds. But now it's culturally gated. What we're really gating out these days is the aliveness of the world and all of this creative potentiality, all of this relational sustenance. And so for me, I think that we can begin to play with the idea of our senses as having so many better ideas if we opened them up like little portals and we began to play with that door of perception. And I do really want to complicate the idea of psychedelics as being the only way to do that. I think that the desire for a heroic dose for a medicine is deeply tied to a kind of colonial desire to accelerate to the solution. And that actually it's very soft and slow work, and you don't need to take a medicine to do it. That there are many ways to skin a default mode network in your brain, and one of them is to just slow down and to just go to the same place every day and to notice what you see and hear and smell and taste. Are the birds singing differently today? Are there different plants there? What's happening? And as you do that, you open yourself up to things you couldn't have expected. Suddenly your environment isn't that homogenized expected projection. There are miracles that can come. That when you gate out the miraculous, you'll only see what you expect, and that can feel safe for a traumatized person, for a traumatized culture. You know, expected realities are safe, but expected realities also don't show us the trap door out of an ecocidal culture. We need to, as you said, leave space open in the text, in our senses, in our relationships for the unexpected to come through.
So I have like two following questions.
Yeah.
I have two following questions to that, which like they go in different directions, but I'm gonna risk like just sending you both of them. So one is if we come back to the text, what is the underworld? Can you share a little bit of what was your process for that text specifically to do this practice of opening up to this like unexpected, So that's more specific. But the other question that came to me while I was listening to you is how to negotiate being vulnerable and open and, this like opening up ourselves to the unexpected in a context of so much systemic violence, because obviously it's not easy, it's like, I'm all for like vulnerability and openness, but there are actual risks in these times that we're living. So those are my
I'll
two
start
questions.
with the second question, which is the work I'm really focused on now is on problematizing our ideas of wholeness, wellness, completion, and having to solve our trauma, get rid of our survival mechanisms. I'm a person with PTSD, early abuse, an incurable illness, and I'm very exiled from narrative arcs of completion and wellness and healing. And I also want to problematize this idea that our survival mechanisms, that our ways of protecting ourselves are always bad. They can be profoundly creative. And so I think that in a culture, in a time period where systems of oppression sediment in certain bodies more than in other bodies, let's problematize the idea of making yourself vulnerable and healed and safe. Sometimes you have to hold on to these strategies to survive. And you don't need to fix them. You don't need to pay thousands of dollars to some, white therapist to teach you how to be more vulnerable to the systems of oppression you're trying to navigate. So that's something I'm really interested in, is can we develop a more complex, robust way of looking at how our bodies creatively respond to oppression, and not try and create a universalized, homogenized idea of what wellness or completeness is. But I sometimes say to be well is to be isolated, to be unwell is to be relational. When you're unwell, when your body doesn't work correctly, it means that you have to create collaborations with other beings. If you're disabled, it means you need to acknowledge that a network of other beings help you exist, and that's creative. That's community. And so I would say that's my response to your second question, which is, let's always be complicating this idea of what we're supposed to be doing with our bodies, with our mental health, with our psychological health. Anna Singh, who's one of my favorite thinkers, says, we live in rubble ecologies. We live in complicated, complicit networks of relationship. We need to salvage a life rather than creating a pure idea of how best to do that. And that's going to look different in different situations. My answer to your first question is, I wrote a lot of this strange, fungal, mythological writing in the depths of quarantine at a time period where I was very uncertain and dealing with physical infirmity, isolation, loneliness, complex ideas about what was going to happen with my own writing. Was it even worth it? And I think that I wrote the piece, What is the Underworld, in a moment in time where I was in the underworld in terms of physical illness and depression, isolation, uncertainty about what was going to happen with COVID. And I thought, how do mythic characters get out of the underworld? And how do biological real beings get out of the underworld? They do it by not on their own, but they always do it by creating connections with other beings. And so for me, it was a way of working out a very personal issue and then sharing it with other people to see if it connected.
That's great. And it connects it connects both of your answers, because then you realize that creativity and imagination and like storytelling in general, it needs community, it needs connections. It needs, like, you cannot do this in isolation. And this has been the sort of picture that we get, that you're this writer and you need to go to these like isolated places and be by yourself and just have this silence. And you know, it was very like determining for many years. It's been like that, you know, that you're this lonely artist, you know, trying to make sense. And really what you're saying is the opposite, you know, is that if we're going to think about structures to heal, to tell stories, to create imagination, then it's going to be in community. It's never going to be
Yeah,
in
and someone said
isolation.
finding community how? Well, if you're disabled like me, bedbound in a room where you can't go out to find your eco-precious, beautiful community of real people or beings, you can do it with your own body. You know, your community can be the dysbiosis of bacteria in your gut. It can be the potato bug in your window. That we need to complexify our ideas of what community and what relationship is like. You know, your community can be the clouds you see out your window. I mean, I also do think that we can hijack social media, which is very complicated, to create feral connections with people who we might not otherwise ever connect with. So I think that social media can be, weirdly enough, a feral way of finding our kin across oceans. I also think that we can find community with people we disagree with in our own neighborhoods. And we need to realize that, you know, the velocity of energy is created by gradients. By the, you know, the difference between the summit and the valley is what carves the rainwater into a river down the side of the mountain. And we need to practice relating to the beings, the people in our actual neighborhood who may have different ideas than us. And they may compel us to become much more agile and nimble with improvising and collaborating. That if we're only ever talking to people who think like us, we never risk being changed.
Yeah, this is so important what you're mentioning, because it's also, and I think it brings us back to what you were talking about evolution at the beginning, because it's like this creative process. And I go back to your phrase, it just means to relinquish something, you know, it just like, and how can we be in relationships that are not always win-win, you know? Can we be in relationships that take some loss from you, you know, that it demands from you to give in or give up some things, you know? I think this is so important what you're talking about. You know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's been a kind of Eurocentric colonial focus on safety inside of culture and psychology and medicine and all of these ideas, but becoming new is never safe. I don't think that those initial bacteria that half digested each other had a safe experience. And I know for me that the moments in time when I've saved myself have not been safe. That they've involved jumping across the ravine, risking changing my mind, risking relationships. That I think we need to begin to learn how to develop the muscle for risky experiences.
And again, you know, the community, so that that risk is not taken, you know, that you're not doing it alone, you know, that there's this
And I was
group
just
to hold
listening
you.
to a great critique of Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score that a friend sent me. And in the discussion, I forget who the thinker was who was talking about it. She was talking about how resilience doesn't belong to an individual. It is a characteristic of a community. It's an epistemology of a community. It's a way a community handles and adapts to different pressures. That we should never locate resilience in an individual. It's always in how networked they are, how many hands they're holding.
Oh, that's beautiful and so important, because so much of the responsibility of our times is placed in the individual, you know, and it's just impossible, you know, it's not going to happen like that.
No.
We need to be holding each other. So you know, we're coming to the close of the hour, but I still want to do some invitations and maybe have some space in case we have questions. But with all that we have spoken today in mind, and you've already mentioned some, but could you offer like a practice or a prompt, you know, for people who are joining us today, how to explore their own creativity beyond, you know, all these paradigms that have been sort of like tying it down?
So I'll offer my favorite daily easy practice, which is I call it gather counsel, which is every day I wake up, I summon by name. I'm not talking about Linnaean taxonomical name. I'm talking about whatever name feels correct. Every being, geological, landform, lake, microbial, indigenous population, folkloric entity, insect I know by name, in a 5-mile radius of my home. I do 20 miles, but you can start with 5. We start small. Summon them. Summon them. Open up a reciprocal vein of blessing. You bless them, they bless you. You acknowledge that you're part of a network, that you're part of a web, and you're just one node in that web. That you can think and feel with that whole web, and they can think and feel with you. And then as you go about your day, as you make art, as you turn on your car, as you make food, you realize that every decision you make implicates an entire network of beings. And that, when you shoot an arrow, that arrow could go back into your own breast. That if you're harming part of your environment, you're harming part of your extended mind, your extended life. And I think that it's a way of bringing in more helpers when you're making work, but also bringing in a complexity to your decision making. Suddenly you're responsible for a lot more beings. When you turn on your car and you spill exhaust into the environment, that's going back into your own body. That's not necessarily bad or good. There's no purity, but it's important to begin to engage that complexity.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's beautiful. And you have to, I really want to underline this thing that there's no purity to it.
No.
Because it can be very overwhelming. You start to realize that you're connected to everything and that everything comes back, and then you feel that you have to get everything right. And, it's not going to be like that. It's going to be more like you're going to get it wrong many, many times. And, just by being alive, we are going to produce harm, more than once. But how can we become more conscious, about that harm, and how can we sort of like do it in in the least, just relinquishing this idea of perfectionism, how can we get creative? Yeah.
Perfectionism is a kind of narcissism. It's an idea that you could ever do it perfectly.
Yes.
The truth is that you are an ant on a huge world. You'll never be able to see the whole picture. How could you ever do it perfectly? You'll never be able to see everything. Just relinquish that narcissism of perfectionism, that it could ever even be possible.
Yeah. And I think it's also to relinquish a little bit the idea that we're solving something, because it's the process, it's about creating. And I don't think, a lot of the issues or problems that we're facing today, I don't think we're necessarily going to see a solution in our lifetimes. A lot of it's going to be messy. It's not going to happen soon. So, to allow ourselves to slow down and realize that we're not rushing into a solution. We're just trying to, get at the time that we get here as in this shape, because then we're going to get another shape and we're going to still be here.
Exactly.
But the time that we get this shape of humans, how do we appreciate this fascinating experience? It's not all about solutions. It's not all about problems. It's still a fascinating experience to be alive and to be humans. How do we sort of reconcile with this idea? Because there's also this message that humans are terrible and we will never do it. But, we're part of this and we're just learning in this process as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're a very particular type of flesh machine. Machine is not the right, a kind of flesh organism that can have certain sensory experiences. And can we delight in that? Can we find the deliciousness in that? I oftentimes say that we're so focused on finding the right medicine. How can we be the medicine? How can we realize that our foot on a certain point in the land is an acupuncture point? Like, how can we find the place in our environments where we need to place ourselves like acupuncture needles? It might not make sense, but, perhaps there is matter in me that wants to go on reunion and pilgrimage to meet matter in that lake or that stream that hasn't met since it was coalesced in a pterodactyl thousands of millions of years ago.
Yeah.
That we are, the vessels for material reunions we'll never be able to even understand.
And that's also beautiful and a very inviting, question, what about this, like the plurality of desire, that it's not it's not me who desires something, there's other, like something in me, parts of me that desire things that I might not, fully understand, and we need to really just explore,
Exactly.
All right, so we have 15 minutes left, something like that, and I would really like to just see if we have some questions in the chat. If people would like to join the conversation through their questions. If not, then in the meantime, while we get some questions, I'm going to ask again about
Oh,
your
someone asked
process.
one.
Oh, yeah.
Isabel Stengers,
Thank
Stengers, and her 2 books on cosmopolitics are fascinating and really good reading about the history of science, you know, all sorts of different tacks into modern paradigms and how they limit what we see and how we can begin to practice them in a more resilient, inclusive way.
Yes, there you go, Stan. I was going to ask a little bit about your research process, because I know you have all these sensorial, and embodied practices, but you also, you've mentioned here like everything that you read and like the researchers that you follow and the thinkers and everything. So, how does that take shape for you, your research process?
I was raised by readers and researchers, by parents who, write long books about the history of religion and society, and I was raised in a reading culture. So I've always appreciated creativity paired with intellectual rigor. That if you have ways of asking really complex questions and then receiving back information, take that information into account. I have, for every book I've written, I've probably read 3,000 books, no exaggeration.
Yeah.
Like, or like papers or articles. I mean, I think curiosity about a subject matter can open up all sorts of different avenues. I do try. I was, very academic for a long time and almost went down that route of becoming, an academic. And I think that I would have closed myself off to more feral, interesting epistemologies. So, if I read every primary document from a certain time period, if I read scientific articles, I also try and reach out to friends and read fiction and talk to people about their ideas about it. Like, I try and engage knowledges that aren't standardized.
Right. Thank you, Sophie. We already have some more questions. So,
okay.
It says, shouldn't our strongest relationship indeed be with nature as our very foundation?
Well, yeah, and there's no split between man and nature. That's just, that's right back down to mind and matter and to Cartesian dualism. We are nature. Microplastics in our blood are nature. That I to go back to questions of purity, everything is nature. Can we begin to work with that in more complex ways? How can I find community I yearn for when I'm often housebound? Yeah, well, that's what I was talking about. I'm often bedbound. In fact, the past month, I've been mostly in bed or on the couch. I think being online, that weirdly enough, we can complicate ideas of only finding community in the right way. That for me, when I was isolated by illness during quarantine, I shared my writing online, I joined classes, I tried to create community in every feral way I could, given that I was so completely physically limited. And so while technology is complicated, it does allow for people who are disabled to create connections they couldn't otherwise. Yeah. And I also think that it complicates the idea of how we learn. Like, academics has been very hard to enter for people from different backgrounds. So there's a big financial barrier. And there's also a cultural barrier. You have to be from a very specific background to even enter into that space. But technology allows us to listen to lectures online, to learn at our own speeds when we're neurodivergent or disabled, to get, course lists, to order books, like to do these things on our own. That not only can we create more feral community, we can also learn without having to dish our money out to the establishment.
That's great, yeah. We have a beautiful question here. How much do you think the healthy symbiotic relationship with our environment relies on our reclaiming our connection to our inner child intuition?
Can I see how much do you think you're healthy symbiotic? So here's the thing, let's complicate healthy, because healthy is this idea of wholeness and completeness of a climactic ecosystem, when the truth is that symbiosis has become a very misunderstood term, but in science it actually represents a continuum from antagonism to mutualism. And any being that's in a symbiotic relationship will never be at just one point on that continuum. You can take a snapshot, on one day, and it will be antagonistic. On another day, it'll be neutral. On another day, it will be mutualistic. So we need to complicate our idea of symbiosis as being something that's always mutually beneficial, always understandable, always legible. So how much do you think that I think a healthy symbiotic relationship with our environment is an understanding that we are entangled with every breath that we take in. We're inhaling microbiome, exhaust, pheromones, and that means that could be bad for us. But if it's bad for us, it's probably also bad for the environment. Can we begin to hold hands with, polluted rivers, with glyphosate-riddled fields? Like, I think healthy is always for me a very burdened word, as someone who is never healthy. And I think the healthiest people I know are people who are quote unquote very unhealthy. To be well inside this culture is not necessarily to be well adapted for the coming collapse. I think actually the people who can hold unwellness or honestly have a musculature for improvisation, physically, creatively, psychologically. A connection to our inner child intuition. I think that when we prize the Eden of the inner child, it's a problematic, it's a theological impulse to return to our purity, to our original childlike sensibility. What we can do is actually try and salvage a more complex sense of wonder that takes into consideration who we are now, the scars, the baggage we have. There's some children who never knew their inner childlike state of wonder. For me, I entered right into violence. Like, there was pretty much no childlike state of innocence. It was just like, I sometimes say I was born in hell and I climbed out. So I think we always need to complicate this idea of returning to the inner child and the inner state of awe and wonder. Can we harness our crooked, disabled, traumatized bodies and realize that their hypersensitivity is hard, but it's also a way of being electrified by the aliveness of the world?
I think we have time for another one. It says, can we talk about spirituality and politics? How can politics be remade through a more rooted spirituality?
How can our politics... Well, I'm not a galaxy brain, and I'll be honest, I don't have much faith in politics right now in the way it's organized. And I'm much more interested in community than I am in politics at this point. I'm much more interested in small local places that are responding to specific ecologies. And I think the idea of politics is deeply paired with colonialism, which is there's one organization that will work for a network of ecologies, a network of different ways of being. But the best way of living in one environment cannot easily be transplanted to another 100 miles away. And so I think politics have to become more local, more culpable, and more ecologically focused. What is specifically happening here in this town, in this valley?
And just to add something to that, I just want to bring poet Patrick Otuama. He speaks about spirituality, and he goes to the root of the word, spirit as breath. And he was talking the other day at a lecture saying that he's very interested in spirituality in the sense that what are the conditions for breathing? What he says that the opposite of spirituality, it's suffocation, So, and I think that is a question that politics can come in easier than, than spirituality. That can be a common language for both, that what are the conditions that, that create breathing, that create respiration, not just for human beings, but for just
That's so beautiful.
Everyone.
And it goes back to all knowledge used to be carried on birds of breath. That most of human history, the whole way that we have transmitted our environmental knowledge or cultural inheritance has been in boats of breath, in oral. Sam Lee, a wonderful musician and environmentalist from England, was talking about the older Scottish folk music traditions, and that the tradition was that you didn't own the music. The first breath was you breathing in the ancestors and the environment, and so whatever came next, your exhalation, was what had entered you. And so can we create that inhalation experience where we are allowed to be infused with the intelligence of the place where we live?
That's beautiful. And I think that's a great point to start closing, because unfortunately we're running out of time. And I just want to have the space to thank you, Sophie, for your time today and for your generosity always when you're sharing in these spaces. Thank you so much for bringing your whole mind and body to these conversations. I also just want to tell everyone that this conversation has been recorded, and you will find it in our Instagram account at Wimblu. You can check out Sophie's text, "What is the Underworld?" in our latest issue as well. And you can subscribe also to our newsletter if you want to get the stories. And again, Sophie, I don't know if you want to take just the last few minutes to say something about your books. You know, you just had a book coming out and you have one in the spring. So if you want to share something about that, please go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for really, really nuanced, creative questions and for welcoming me into this space. My book, The Flowering Wand, is out. I have a novel, which is my eco-feminist retelling of the Gospels, or as I've been calling it, my sexy Jesus book. Comes out this summer. I'm finishing up a book on disability and ecology, and I'm teaching a course on that starts this Sunday through Science and Non-Duality. If anyone wants to join, it's for people with treatment fatigue who are tired with healing narratives. But yeah.
And you can also subscribe to your newsletter. You know, you have.
Oh yeah, and I have my Substack. Where I'm actually about to post a new essay about dogs.
Highly recommended. Yeah. Yeah. All right, Sophie, I think this is the end for us. Thank you so much for being here, and let's keep in touch. I'm really happy about this collaboration, and let's hope that it's just the first among many.
Thank you so much, and thank you everyone.
If you want to support our project, you can share this episode. Visit our digital magazine, wimblu.com, subscribe to our newsletter, or join our Patreon community where you can access exclusive content starting at $3 a month. Your support allows us to create and share content that reimagines a fair and healthy world for all life forms.